In the 1880s, Japanese immigrants called the Issei and Nisei began coming to the west coast of the United States for work. For most of them, life was good. Then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Working with others in the War Department, General DeWitt developed a plan to remove all the Issei and Nisei from their homes in the western states and lock them in prison camps.
United States Executive Order 9066 was a United States presidential executive order signed and issued during World War II by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, authorizing the Secretary of War to prescribe certain areas as military zones. Eventually, EO 9066 cleared the way for the relocation of Japanese Americans to internment camps. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, pressure was increasing on politicians on the West Coast. They demanded that something must be done about the Issei and Nisei living there. It was rumored that Japanese Americans were preparing for an invasion of the United States. However, upon investigating, the Army and the FBI found no proof of this to be true. Despite the investigation, General John L. DeWitt felt that the Japanese were waiting for the invasion to begin. Working with the War Department, DeWitt developed a plan to remove Japanese Americans from their homes and lock them in prison camps. When Executive Order 9066 was established on February 19th of 1942, it affected about 120,000 citizens and non-citizens of the Japanese origin. The reason for removing an entire ethnic group was for the purpose of protection against espionage and against sabotage. Furthermore, Congress made it a crime to refuse to leave a military area when ordered to do so. On March 2nd of 1942, General DeWitt issued orders that required all people of Japanese descent in 8 western states to report to temporary assembly centers. When they arrived, the government transported them to permanent relocation centers, where they would remain for the next 4 years. More than 60% of those ordered to evacuate were U.S. citizens. None had a hearing before the government locked them in relocation camps. Once in the camps, however, the government asked them to sign a loyalty oath to the United States. Although most did, 4% refused to take the oath because of how they have been treated. The government classified these individuals as disloyal. Executive Order 9066 was designated by Gerald Ford on February 19, 1976. In 1980, Jimmy Carter signed legislation to create the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, also known as CWRIC. The CWRIC was appointed to conduct an official government study of Executive Order 9066 related to wartime orders and their impact on Japanese Americans in the West. In December of 1982, the CWRIC issued its findings in an article entitled "Personal Justice Denied," concluding that incarceration of Japanese Americans had not been justified by military necessity. The report determined that the decision to incarcerate was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The Commission recommended legislative remedies consisting of an official government apology and a redress payments of $20,000 to each of the survivors. A public education fund was set up to help ensure that this would not happen again. On August 10, 1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, based on the CWRIC's recommendations, was signed into law by Ronald Reagan. On November 21, 1989, George H.W. Bush signed an appropriation bill authorizing payments to be paid out between 1990 and 1998. In 1990, surviving internees began to receive individual redress payments and a letter of apology.
Fred Korematsu was survived by his Issei immigrant parents in Oakland, California. He was an Issei and an American citizen. At age 22, in 1942, General DeWitt ordered everyone of Japanese ancestry in the western U.S. to report to assembly centers. However, Korematsu was in love with an Italian-American girl and decided he did not want to leave his home near Oakland. After Korematsu refused to report for internment, he changed his name and even underwent eyelid surgery to make him look less Japanese. However, on May 30, 1942, government authorities finally tracked Korematsu down. He was arrested for remaining in a military area that was barred to any Japanese. Korematsu was sentenced to 5 years probation after his conviction in a federal court. The military immediately took him into custody, however, and sent him to the relocation camp in Topaz, Utah. The American Civil Liberties Union persuaded Korematsu to appeal his case. In October 1944, when Korematsu's case reached the Supreme Court, the attorneys for the government pointed to the constitutional war powers of Congress and the President. The government argued that the military must take all steps necessary to wage war successfully. To President Roosevelt, the War Department, and General DeWitt, the internment of all Japanese Issei and Nisei was a military necessity. Further argued by the government attorneys was the fact that there was an inadequate amount of time to hold hearings or trials to determine who was and was not legal. They presented a report from General DeWitt, who repeated many of the unproved rumors about Issei and Nisei disloyalty. The government also cited those in the camps who had refused to sign the loyalty oath. Korematsu was represented by the American Civil Liberties Union and the Japanese American Citizens League. They argued that there was no military necessity for removing and imprisoning all persons of Japanese ancestry without a hearing or a trial. Korematsu's attorneys showed that during the almost 4 months between Pearl Harbor and General DeWitt's first evacuation order, not one person of Japanese descent had been convicted of espionage or sabotage. They stated that instead of uprooting 120,000 men, women, and children from their homes, the government simply could have barred them from specific military and industrial sites. So if military necessity was not the reason for the evacuations and imprisonments, as argued by Korematsu's lawyers, then what was? They charged that General DeWitt accepted the prejudiced views of those hostile to the Issei and Nisei and was himself a racist. To prove their point, they quoted DeWitt with this statement, quote, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not. I don't want any of them. They are a dangerous element, whether loyal or not," unquote. This statement was said before a congressional committee in 1943. On December 18, 1944, with a Supreme Court vote of 6-3, the decision was made to uphold the conviction of Korematsu. The majority ruled only on his refusal to leave a prohibited military area and did not consider the constitutionality of the relocation. Justice Hugo Black, writing for the majority, fully accepted the views of DeWitt and said Korematsu had not been forced from his home because of his race, but because of the military urgency of the situation. However, 3 of the justices vigorously dissented from the majority opinion. Justice Robert Jackson denied that government could simply declare all members of a racial group guilty and imprison them. He wrote that guilt is personal and not inheritable. Justice Owen Roberts condemned the imprisonment of a citizen without evidence or inquiry concerning his loyalty. And Justice Frank Murphy called the majority opinion this legalization of racism.
When the Supreme Court made its Korematsu decision, the justices also decided another case that resulted in finally closing down the prison camps. The Supreme Court ruled that President Roosevelt's executive order and the enforcement law passed by Congress only authorized removal of the Issei and Nisei from military areas, not their imprisonment. The court never squarely decided whether the government could have legally issued orders and passed laws to establish a prison camp system. When the Issei and the Nisei left the camps, the government granted them $25 per person or $50 per family and train fare home. In 1948, Congress partially compensated them for their loss of their businesses or property. In 1980, President Carter appointed a special commission to investigate the entire internment affair. The commission concluded that the decisions to remove those of Japanese ancestry from prison camps occurred because of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In 1988, Congress apologized and granted personal compensation of $20,000 to each surviving prisoner. Korematsu had one more day in court. Researchers discovered that the government had withheld important facts at his trial. The documents that they found consistently showed that Japanese Americans had committed no acts of treason to justify mass incarceration. In 1984, a federal judge agreed that Korematsu probably did not get a fair trial and set aside his conviction. During wartime, the Bill of Rights has often become less important to Americans than the need for national security, as Fred Korematsu found out. The problem in wartime is to achieve what Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist terms a proper balance between civil liberties and protection. A few months after September 11th, Fred Korematsu, then at the age of 82, spoke to students at Stanford University. He said that he never lost faith in the American system of justice. "You have to fight for your rights," he declared. "Don't be afraid."